Introduction. Forget the palaces and the immense wealth of the dynasty for a moment. To understand the Rothschilds, we have to go back to where it really began, a cramped, narrow street in Frankfurt's Jewish quarter. In this episode, we're tracing the family's incredible arc from rare coin brokers trading metals with princes to becoming the financiers of kings. I'll be separating the myths from the reality and sharing the biggest lessons I took from the House of Rothschild, money's prophets. From Red Shield to Rothschild. The name Rothschild sounds mysterious now, but the origin is almost comically simple. In 18th century Frankfurt, the family house had a red shield hanging over the door. That was it. Neighbors call it the Haus zum Roten Schild, the one with the red sign. And over time, that nickname hardens into a surname. No secret order, no hidden symbol, just a painted sign over a cramped doorway in a dirty, overcrowded street. And that doorway opens into a world that's just as harsh as the name is plain. In Frankfurt, Jews are pushed into a narrow strip of city called the Judengasse, or Judenhaus. There are walls and gates. It feels less like a neighborhood and more like an open-air cell. You can't just wander in and out. If you want to leave, you need permission. You're expected to wear clothes or markers that show you're Jewish and different. Even the most intimate parts of life are regulated. The city caps how many Jewish weddings can happen, which is a quiet way of capping how many Jewish families and children there will be. The place is packed and run down. Houses are decaying. Infrastructure is awful. Conditions are so bad that some Jews call it the coffin. That image is brutal but accurate. You're technically alive, but the space you live in feels like it's designed to keep you small and buried. In a world like that, putting your faith in any one state or ruler doesn't make much sense. Tomorrow's decree can undo today's tolerance. So instead of patriotic loyalty to one flag, many Jewish families, including the Rothschilds, start anchoring their loyalty somewhere else, in the family, in their own long-term interest, and in Jewish networks that stretch across borders. Their country becomes the house, the name, the religion, and the trade routes they stitch together wherever they're allowed to work. It's a painful history, but it accidentally trains them to think differently from their Christian neighbors. While most elites are still thinking in terms of one country, one set of laws, the Rothschilds are already mapping the world in routes, contacts, letters, and currency flows that cross entire regions. And in the chapters that follow, that borderless mental map, plus a lot of discipline, is exactly what turns a ghetto house under a red shield into real power. Meyer Amschel. Coins, trophies, and trust. There's no big bank at the start of this story. In Meyer Amschel Rothschild's world, most respectable jobs are simply closed to Jews. Guild trades, many professions, public offices, you're shut out before you even begin. Work isn't a menu of options. It's a narrow corridor, and survival means finding some tiny niche that the law still allows. So, Jewish families in Frankfurt crowd into the few roles they're permitted. Petty trading, money changing, dealing in second-hand or specialist goods. Meyer does exactly that. He doesn't launch M. Rothschild & Sons. He opens a tiny business dealing in rare coins, metals, and trophies. Basically coin brokerage and trophy dealing. The same kind of niche work a lot of Jews are doing just to scrape by. But what makes his story different is what he manages to build on top of that narrow niche. Those rare coins and metals attract a very specific clientele: princes, nobles, rich collectors, people who matter. By being obsessive about keeping his word, delivering what he promises, and not cutting corners, Meyer slowly stops being just another trader from the Judengasse and becomes a name people at court actually trust. Out of one of the few jobs Jews are legally allowed to hold, he builds something the law can't touch: a reputation. Honesty, reliability, discretion. That reputation becomes his real starting capital and the foundation stone for everything the House of Rothschild will become later. From cloth sense to credit sense. While Meyer is anchoring the family in Frankfurt, another crucial move happens. He sends his son Nathan to England. Nathan arrives in Manchester around 1800, right in the middle of the English Industrial Revolution. He's not a banker. He's a young guy trying to figure things out. What he sees blows his mind. Factories cranking out cloth with machines, way faster and cheaper than traditional workshop methods on the continent. That price gap is pure opportunity. So he starts small. He buys English textiles and sells them into Europe, with very limited capital. The goal at first isn't domination, it's learning. Understand the business, the roots, the players. Then the real challenge shows up. It's not selling cloth, it's managing cash. The textile trade lives on razor-thin margins and tiny timing advantages. Nathan starts pushing on the levers he can control. With manufacturers, he offers to pay in advance, before production, in exchange for lower prices. With his buyers in Europe, he offers generous payment terms, often months after the goods arrive. That creates a nasty time gap. Money goes out today, money comes back 5 or 6 months later. In between, ships can sink or stall, fashions can change, politics can blow up a route. So to survive, he has to level up fast. He learns how to manage working capital across time, how to discount bills, how to juggle obligations, how to hedge between sterling and continental currencies, and how to use faster information as a weapon for timing his deals. But the big takeaway is not Nathan the Cloth King. It's the mindset shift that the book sums up as going from cloth sense to credit sense. He learns to think like a financier while still being officially in the textile trade, how to keep money flowing in a complex, delayed, risky system. That mental upgrade is worth more than any single batch of fabric he ever ships. Nathan as a pirate. Then politics slams straight into the business. Just as Nathan's getting good at juggling cloth and credit, tensions between Britain and continental Europe explode. Napoleon's continental system is supposed to lock British goods out of Europe. Britain fires back with naval blockades. On paper, English cloth and English gold are not supposed to touch French-controlled ports at all. That wrecks the clean trade routes Nathan had been using. One decree and suddenly your shipments can't land, one blockade and a whole season's orders are stuck. The early Rothschild operations get dragged up and down with these waves. Nothing is steady, so Nathan either adapts or goes under. Out of that chaos, a new strength appears. Logistics under pressure, and Nathan becomes a pirate. By the early 2010s, the Rothschild network can move almost anything from almost anywhere, thanks to their growing web of correspondents and couriers across a continent full of customs checks and wartime rules. On the map, French law says one thing and British law says another. In real life, smuggling becomes the bloodstream of the wartime economy. The elector's treasure, rumor and reality. While all this trade and smuggling is going on, the Rothschilds' relationship with political power is getting deeper too. The book and the history zoom in on one key client, the Elector of Hesse and his treasure. This isn't just some random noble savings account. For decades, his state has been renting out troops to bigger powers like Britain, especially during the American Wars, and those subsidies have piled up into one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. During the French invasions, the elector needs to protect this mountain of wealth. The popular rumor is dramatic. About 14 chests filled with valuables secretly handed to the Rothschilds, who keep most of it and quietly use it to build their own fortune. That's a great conspiracy story. And like all great conspiracy stories, it's only half anchored to reality. The book's reconstruction is much more precise. Of those chests, only a couple actually end up under Rothschild control. And they don't just bury them in a garden and wait. They use the assets actively on the elector's behalf, paying his debts, financing operations, keeping his money working instead of frozen during the chaos. In other words, they act as managers and guardians, not simple hoarders. When the war pressure eases and the elector comes back, Meyer is ready to settle up. The valuables are returned with interest, calculated at the going rates of the time. Instead of being angry, the elector is pleased. His wealth has survived and even grown while he was gone. He keeps the Rothschilds on as his financial agents.
From there, the link to Nathan is straightforward. The same machinery we just saw, routes, couriers, bullion deals, and cross-border credits, is now applied to part of the elector's fortune. With Nathan's help, some of that capital is quietly moved into England, where the opportunities look better. The episode matters because it shows the pattern so clearly. They walk into a risky situation, holding someone else's treasure, take real responsibility, handle it well, and come out of it with more trust, more business, and much deeper ties to power. So on the surface, you have Nathan, the London financier. Underneath, you've got something much closer to a financial pirate. No cannons, no skull and crossbones, but the same basic playbook. Dodge the blockades, move faster than the navies and the customs men, and turn impossible movements of value into very real profit. House rules. Eventually, Meyer dies, reportedly from a common illness. But by the time that happens, he's already done a lot of thinking about what happens after him. He doesn't want the house to fall apart into 5 competing branches. He wants one house with 5 arms. So in 1810, he locks his sons into a 10-year, non-cancelable partnership. They are required to act as one firm, not as separate little empires, each doing their own thing. In his will, he goes further. Daughters and son-in-laws are explicitly excluded from the bank. Control stays with the sons. To us, that feels harsh, but from his point of view, it's about keeping outsiders and their agendas away from the core capital. Around those legal rules, he builds an unwritten one: secrecy. For Meyer, banking is not just about profit, it's about silence. Business isn't to be discussed outside the family. Letters should be careful, coded, and, where possible, destroyed after reading. The fewer people who see the full picture, the safer the house is. Reputation is built in public. Information is handled in private. Over time, this becomes almost a second business model. Their own balance sheets get layered and deliberately hard to read. Many letters, especially Nathan's, as the commanding general of the family and the main income generator, are burned or lost. Later in the book, this becomes a big headache for historians. They're trying to piece together Nathan's role from fragments because so much of the original correspondence simply no longer exists.
The result is that even today, nobody can say with confidence exactly how big the Rothschild empire really was at its peak. Most estimates of their total wealth are educated guesses sitting on top of incomplete evidence, not a clean set of audited accounts. But out of that secrecy and those rules, some clear principles emerge. The brothers must act jointly. They must avoid showy, excessive profits that could trigger a backlash. They must protect the name. And they must keep the details of how they do it out of view. Rulers and clients trust them, not only because they can raise money, but because they can keep their mouths shut. Amschel, the eldest, stays in Frankfurt as the senior partner, and Nathan continues to stay in London. The other brothers fan out to Paris, Vienna, and Naples, tied together by Mayer's rules and by a constant flow of tight, information-packed letters. They argue, sometimes bitterly, and they come close more than once to the kind of split Mayer feared. But they never quite cross that line. Decades after his death, they're still living under his double command: stay together and keep the business in the dark. War and profit. Waterloo is the big cinematic moment everyone loves. June 1815, muddy fields in what's now Belgium. Napoleon versus Wellington. If Napoleon had won, Britain's massive war debt might suddenly have looked shaky. The famous story about the Rothschilds goes like this. Nathan Rothschild, using his private couriers, hears about the victory before the British government, which is actually true. He then shows up at the London Stock Exchange looking grim, quietly dumps British bonds, and triggers panic. Everyone assumes Britain has lost. Prices crash, and at the bottom, he snaps everything up. When the official news of victory finally arrives, bond prices shoot back up, and in one afternoon, the Rothschilds supposedly take control of British finance. It's a fantastic story. It's neat, it's visual, it explains a lot in one go. But the book's version is more complicated. By the time Waterloo happens, the brothers are already deeply embedded in European finance. They have an information network. They're used to long, risky money cycles, and they have serious government contacts. In 1814 to 1815, they're handling enormous intergovernmental transfers, war subsidies, troop payments, reconstruction money, on a scale almost no one else can match. Every one of those deals has multiple profit layers: a commission on the transfer itself, gains from shifts in exchange rates, and interest when they quietly lend part of the money. Stack those layers, and you can earn huge returns even if the visible fee looks modest. So yes, the Waterloo years bring very big profits. Yes, their information really does move faster than most governments' news. But when the author goes back through the records that do survive, there's no smoking gun of a single Waterloo trade that explains everything. Instead, you see a dense, risky web of wartime finance, subsidies, and currency bets. The book calls these gains more mysterious and hazardous than the traditional Waterloo myth implies. And then secrecy kicks in again. Their internal accounts are complex, by design. Many of the key letters, especially Nathan's, are gone. What's left, bits of ledgers, fragments of correspondence, shows that their wealth jumps sharply around this time, but not exactly why. I wouldn't say we can prove manipulation, but the way they operated definitely leaves space for that suspicion. What we can say is that after the war ends, there's a twist. Peace actually hurts them. Once the emergency is over, the demand for huge, urgent state loans and transfers drops. Governments don't need war finance in the same way. For the first time, the Rothschilds face real competition from other banking houses that feel strong enough to play in a calmer market. The roaring flow of business they enjoyed in 1814 to 1815 slows down. Inside the firm, that slowdown exposes another problem. Their bookkeeping hasn't kept up with their growth. In their letters, the brothers admit they're not even sure how much money they have or where it all is. At one point, they half joke that they might be very rich or almost broke, simply because no one has a clear, consolidated view of the accounts. The network has grown so wide and so tangled that for a while, they're half blind inside their own creation.
Before we go any further, it's worth spelling out, in simple terms, what the Rothschilds actually do for most of this period. They're not running a normal bank with branches and little savings accounts. Their real business is selling promises. Governments need huge amounts of money up front to fight a war, rebuild, or roll over old debts, but they can't just print it without destroying trust. So they issue bonds, long pieces of paper that say, "Lend us this much now, we'll pay you interest every year and give you your money back at the end." The Rothschilds sit in the middle of that process. They agree to take a whole loan from a government at a set price, then they slice it into smaller pieces and sell those pieces on to investors across Europe. In return, they don't just collect a fee, they stand behind the deal. They use their network to move the money to the government, to move the interest payments back to investors, and when needed, to support the price of the bond in the market so it doesn't collapse the first time there's a scare. That's why their name matters so much. A Rothschild bond is not just a bet on a state, it's a bet that the Rothschilds themselves will keep the cash flows moving. The Rothschilds actually created this international bond market in its modern form. They turned big, messy government borrowing into tradable pieces that a lot of investors can hold. They quote prices, organize syndicates, smooth out payments across currencies and borders, and quietly use their own money to keep the whole thing looking stable. When you put all these early chapters together, the story looks a lot less like magic and a lot more like timing plus structure. Over and over, the Rothschilds end up as the right people in the right place at the right time. Meyer as a trusted Jewish court agent, just when a war-rich elector needs someone discreet. Nathan in England exactly as the Industrial Revolution and London finance are taking off. The most aggressive son is standing in the city that's about to become the world's financial capital, right when Europe's money starts flowing through it. This has stronger lessons for us today, especially if you're thinking about business or family business. Power doesn't come from one Waterloo moment. It comes from being ready when history opens a door, sending the right person to the right market at the right time, building a name other people will trust with their fortunes, staying united when the numbers, the egos, and the distances all get bigger, pushing information fast inside the family while showing very little of it to the outside world, and backing all of that with systems and numbers that can survive both war and peace. The early Rothschilds show just how far a family can go when timing, reputation, discipline, and carefully managed secrecy line up and keep reinforcing each other for decades. That's the first act of the Rothschild story. The second act is about what they do with that machine once it's built. Saving the Bank of England. You really see what Rothschild discipline means when the music stops in London. A big banking crisis hits, and suddenly it feels like money just disappears. Dozens of firms start to wobble, and right in the middle of all this, even the Bank of England, the place that's supposed to be the rock of the whole system, is scrambling for gold just to stay open. This isn't some small local bank in trouble. This is the heart of British finance on the edge. The Rothschilds' response is super simple. Use the network. They pull gold from different markets across Europe and funnel it straight into London, straight into the Bank of England's vaults. One historian calls this a remarkable achievement which owed everything to the international nature of the Rothschilds' operations. And that's exactly the point. It's not just about having money, it's about having speed, information, trusted partners, and couriers already in motion. In a world built on promises, they are one of the very few players who can actually make good on those promises faster than the central bank itself. That changes how everyone looks at them.
But the moment you start saving central banks, you don't get to stay invisible anymore. After the Napoleonic Wars, the press opens up, censorship relaxes, and suddenly the Rothschild name is everywhere. Karl writes as early as 1816 that they're becoming very famous because people just won't stop writing about them. And fame, of course, cuts both ways. A lot of the new attention is hostile, and a lot of that hostility has nothing to do with balance sheets and everything to do with the fact that they're Jews. Historians point out that they were attacked far more often than they were praised, partly because for anti-emancipation people, a Jewish family at the very top of European capitalism is almost unbearable. Bruno Bauer has that nasty but telling line, "The Jew who may have no rights in the smallest German states decides the fate of Europe." That's both a compliment and an accusation in one sentence. Now, if you zoom out from the headlines and look at what the family is actually doing on the ground, the picture is very different. Philanthropy, tzedakah, isn't a side hobby for them. It's part of the operating budget. Across the 5 houses, you see the same pattern. Money for Jewish schools, synagogues, burial and relief societies, support for legal campaigns to loosen anti-Jewish laws, emergency help after riots or economic crashes.
In London especially, education becomes the big cause. They're convinced that literacy and proper qualifications are the safest way to open doors and reduce how vulnerable Jews are in the long run. And they're not just doing this out of guilt or habit. The brothers actually see themselves as role models. If we can succeed without converting, the logic goes, then the pressure to convert looks weaker. Because most conversions at the time are not about theology. They're people trying to escape legal discrimination. The Rothschilds want to prove you can stay Jewish and still move up. Inside the family, they're also thinking about how to keep this whole machine tight across 5 houses. One of their tools is who marries whom. There's no formal clause in the Founding Fathers' will saying you must marry your cousin, but in practice, that's what often happens. A Rothschild for a Rothschild. The idea is simple. Keep the capital in the family, keep the information in the family, and you don't have to constantly renegotiate trust with outsiders. Cohesion, control, continuity. And all of this money, reputation, and family strategy flows into politics too. They use their access to bring Jewish issues into the room. Amschel even pushes for Solomon to go to the Congress of Aix in the interest of the whole Jewry, not just to chase deals. So on one side, you have anti-Semitic writers saying, the Jews decide the fate of Europe. On the other side, you have the same family quietly funding schools, fixing burnt-out shops after riots, pushing ministers to ease restrictions. Whether you see that as terrifying or admirable depends a lot on where you stand. But if you look at the numbers, the classrooms they build, and the crises they help calm, it's clear that for a while, this one family isn't just moving money around. They're helping to shape how 19th century Europe actually works. From money to status. Up to this point, the story is much about finance rather than the social climbing. The brothers are already rich and successful, but they're not still seen as truly high class in Europe, mostly because of their religion and their origins. So the next phase of the book is really about their entry into high society, how they try to turn raw cash into status, and eventually protection. The funny part is, they actually hate most of the social life they have to perform. One brother thanks God when his dinners are finally over. Karl calls the whole thing expensive humbug and jokes that it was very nice, but the money was nicer when the star chef's bill arrives. Then he shrugs and admits, these parties are basically as good as bribes. That one line captures their mindset perfectly. They're not throwing balls for fun, they're investing in influence. And it's not just about giving parties. In a Europe still obsessed with ranks and orders, they rush to grab the visible symbols of status, titles, decorations, huge townhouses, country estates, walls covered with famous paintings. The same states that once shut Jews out now hand the Rothschilds coats of arms and baronial titles because they're simply too useful to ignore. As one line in the book sums it up, they find it almost easy to become barons, wearers of royal orders, property owners, and society hosts. It's the classic Rothschild move. Take a barrier that was supposed to keep you out and turn it into another asset on the balance sheet. Karl is the one who leans into this world the hardest. He becomes obsessed with being accepted by the local high society. He hosts regular dinners, hires a celebrated French chef whose cooking becomes part of the family's brand, and organizes ball after ball with endless dancing, huge feasts, and armies of servants. It's insanely expensive, but it's also how you signal that your house belongs among the elite. At one point, Karl writes to Nathan, basically saying, "These events are draining me, but I have to keep doing them or people will think the family's in trouble." And that's another key lesson. In their world, if you don't at least match last year's display, the rumor mill will instantly turn it into a story about your finances. And they slowly move into the classic aristocratic hobbies: art collecting, shooting, music, horses. Each house has slightly different tastes, but together they start buying serious works from earlier centuries and hanging them in their mansions. They purchase large rural estates to host shooting parties, and the younger generation joins in. The women of the family learn piano from some of the most famous musicians, such as Chopin, who become not just teachers, but guests at family events and weddings. They build friendships with leading writers and poets. Some of the houses get deeply into horse racing, spending huge sums on top bloodlines, organizing races, and even winning them. It's all part of the same long game, turning financial capital into cultural and social capital that will still be there even if markets swing. The payoff is that they no longer have to fight their way into salons and country houses. They're operating from inside them. And once you're inside that world of ministers, grandees, and old nobility, high society turns into an informal information network. Gossip about alliances, hints of policy shifts, early whispers of war or peace moving quietly around the dinner table. The brothers use money not just to make more money, but to buy their way into these circles where social life and market intelligence blur together. And that access gives them a constant edge in reading Europe and placing their bets.
Working with slow, patchy 19th century postal systems is not good enough when every hour of information delay can cost you a fortune. So they build their own communication network. Nathan is already paying ship captains extra to rush his letters across the channel. Over time, the houses develop a private system of couriers, agents, and codes that is faster and more reliable than many official government channels. Diplomat after diplomat quietly starts using the Rothschild network to send non-binding messages precisely because it's quicker and more discreet than the formal state courier service. For the brothers, this is gold. If you consistently get political news first, before most governments, before other bankers, you can buy or sell bonds while everyone else is still in the dark. That is the Rothschild playbook in pure form. And that edge doesn't always line up neatly with their public image. On paper, they are the great defenders of peace. In practice, they sometimes hedge. Nathan manages to sell guns to the Russian government just days after a key battle in Poland. James is delighted with the profit, but begs his brother not to let their name appear publicly in the deal. He's terrified people will say he's selling weapons to help shoot Poles. At the same time, the brothers are involved in selling tens of thousands of British guns and other supplies to the French as well. So yes, they talk peace, but they are also businessmen. They don't start wars, but if others insist on fighting, they're not above making sure they profit whichever way events break. It's no surprise then that the way people talk about them becomes more and more epic. One aristocrat jokes that the leading Rothschild can be compared to the Sultan. The Sultan rules all believers, but Rothschild is the creditor of all rulers. My favorite line, and the one I wrote down several times, is that they are not the king of the Jews, but the Jew of the kings. That sentence alone captures how far they've come, from the Frankfurt ghetto to a position where every major power in Europe has to reckon with them. Then the book hits one of its most emotional chapters, Nathan's death. It happens around a family wedding when everyone is together. Nathan suddenly falls seriously ill. Doctors tell him to rest, to avoid exertion, but he forces himself to attend the celebration anyway, then collapses into weeks and months of weakness. In the end, even he cannot fight it. He dies, and the shock runs through the family and through the markets. As a side note, he was possibly the richest private individual on Earth when he died. The reaction to his death shows us how central he was. It's not just his brothers and sons who are devastated. Some of the most important figures in Britain and Europe turn up at his funeral, along with crowds of Jews who never met him but know exactly what he represents. The British bond market even slows and stumbles in the days after his death. Just the fact that one man's death can move the market tells you everything about his role. According to the inheritance records, his sons inherit one of the largest private fortunes in the world at the time, rivaled mainly by royal families. Again, the message is clear. This is the richest private dynasty in Europe. But Nathan's death is also a test for the system. Technically, each Rothschild house is a separate entity. In reality, Nathan has been the commander-in-chief, coordinating big transfers, steering strategy, and stepping in when his brothers need help. Part of that is because he sits in London, the financial capital of the world. Part of it is his personality. After he's gone, there is a leadership gap. James tries several times to fill the role, but it never quite clicks in the same way. The family carries on as a powerful partnership, but without the single, dominant figure at the center. One lesson here. Even a dynasty built on structures and systems can still be exposed to a key man risk. Just a few years after Nathan's death, the family is hit by what they themselves call a catastrophe. His daughter, Hannah Mayer, renounces Judaism to marry a Christian, Henry Fitzroy. The wedding is at St. George's, Hanover Square. Only her brother Nat goes into the church, while her mother walks her no further than the gate. A few weeks later, the Times reports that the marriage was conditional on her embracing the Christian religion and points out that her uncles are far from pleased with a match that requires a change of faith. Inside the family, the reactions are even more intense. James writes that she has robbed our whole family of its pride and caused us such harm that it can no longer be redressed, and insists that religion means everything. Our good fortune and our blessings depend upon it. In his eyes, abandoning the religion of our father, the religion which, thank God, made us so great, is not just a private choice, but an attack on the foundations of the dynasty itself. The decision leads to talk of cutting her off as if she had never existed, and raises real fears that the unity of the family could break. It's a moment where you see how tightly their playbook ties money, identity, and endogamy together. Without the shared religion and marriage rules, they worry there may never be a Rothschild system. On the strictly financial side, one of the most painful lessons comes from Iberia, what is now Spain and Portugal. In the 1830s, they plunge into Portuguese and Spanish bonds just as both countries are swallowed by dynastic civil wars. Interest payments start breaking down. Family pushes through a major Spanish loan, a huge advance that shakes the whole partnership. Eventually, to recover something, the Spanish government hands them control of the Almaden mercury mines instead of cash. That ends up becoming a very profitable quasi-monopoly. That Iberian experience colors everything when they look westwards. Ferguson points out that their route into the Americas goes through Spain. The same networks that connect them to Madrid pull them into Cuba, Mexico, and, almost by accident, the United States. But the U.S. turns out to be structurally awkward for the Rothschild model. The federal government borrows relatively little. Most of the debt is issued by individual states, many of which later default. Bank of America, the kind of central institution they love to work with, is destroyed. There's no single reliable government borrower at the center of the system. On top of that, they never solve the human side of the problem. Who is actually going to live there and run a full American house? There is serious talk of sending a younger Rothschild to create a sixth house in the U.S., but it never happens. James is excited, his nephews are not. None of the new generation is willing to leave Europe and start again. So they rely on a thin chain of agents, make some money, lose some, and never build the kind of embedded and powerful position they have in London, Paris, or Vienna. With hindsight, Ferguson calls this their biggest missed opportunity. The U.S. becomes the financial center of the world in the next century, and the Rothschilds are never as deeply rooted there as they might have been.
One of the most striking chapters for me is the one on Damascus. In 1840, a priest and his servant disappear in the city. They're last seen near the Jewish quarter, and rumors quickly turned it into a classic ritual murder accusation. Leading Jews are arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to a crime that, as the book makes very clear, almost certainly never happened. The news spreads fast. Letters start arriving for the Rothschilds from Jewish communities in the region and in Europe. Writers beg them to talk to kings and ministers and say, in effect, "You are the bankers of rulers and the leaders of the Jews. Only you have the power to help us." By this point, the family already has a kind of mythic status in Jewish eyes, not just rich, but almost symbolic. The Jews of the kings, and in the public imagination, the kings of the Jews. The brothers act. In one capital, they use their diplomatic contacts to push the government into raising the issue. When that stalls, they turn to what one of them calls the all-powerful method, the press. They feed reports of the tortures to major newspapers to whip up public pressure. Elsewhere, they help local Jewish leaders raise money and send a high-profile delegation to Egypt and Syria. That mission eventually secures a formal decree denying the blood libel and ordering the prisoner's release. In their private letters, the brothers talk about stopping slanders against their religion and preventing Jews from being tortured with impunity in the East. It's not just business. By now, they feel a responsibility to defend their people. After Damascus, Western Jews start talking more seriously about concrete projects in the Holy Land.
One idea is a Jewish hospital in Jerusalem. The Rothschilds are interested, but only if there's also a modern school attached. Not just charitable care, but education. The local community pushes back on the more secular side of the plan, and the project stalls for a while. So again, what you actually see in the sources is welfare and education, not yet a secret plan to buy a country. At the same time, outsiders begin projecting much bigger dreams onto the Rothschild name. Newspapers and commentators imagine scenarios where the Sultan, desperate for cash, sells Jerusalem to them. Writers fantasize about the family gathering Jews in Palestine and restoring the throne of David and Solomon. Ferguson is very clear. There's no evidence in this period that the Rothschilds themselves are trying to buy Palestine or create a Jewish state. Their direct role in what later becomes Zionism belongs to a later generation. But Damascus is the moment when three threads first knot together in a visible way: their financial power, their Jewish identity, and other people's hopes for a future homeland. Finally, the railway chapter shows their playbook under pressure from a completely new technology. In the 1840s, railways are the hot sector in Europe. James has already helped build a line to move salt and coal from the mines to the capital, and has invested in ironworks, coal fields, and even steamships to control the whole supply chain. He sees railways as the long-term skeleton of Europe, lines connecting major cities, feeding factories with cheap coal, and creating new trade routes. His dream is the Nord Line out of Paris, which he treats as the spine of a future network. He's prepared to fight politically, spend heavily, and use friendly newspapers to win the concession. But he can't do it alone. The capital needed is huge, so he turns to his London nephews. And this is where you really see the family dynamic. The uncle in Paris is all in on the new technology. The nephews in London are skeptical and a bit grumpy. From Newcourt, they complain that there's nothing new here but railroad companies, that stinking railroads take up all their time, and that they're already up to their necks in steam for too little return. Their rule of thumb is simple: when everyone wants into a sector, be careful. What surprised me is that the roles are reversed from the stereotype. It's the older generation pushing innovation and the younger generation playing risk manager. In the end, they reach a classic Rothschild compromise. London agrees to help place large amounts of French railway stock with British investors, but keeps a certain distance. The London House focuses on the financial side: underwriting, distributing, trading, while James builds deep, long-term industrial positions in the Nord and in the coal mines that feed it. When the railway bubble shakes in 1848, London's caution protects them from the worst of the slump. Over the longer run, though, it means Paris captures most of the giant industrial gains from continental rail and coal in the second half of the century.
1848, when the music stops. Right after the railway boom, the book closes on the moment when everything almost blows up: the revolutions of 1848. Across Europe, you have years of bad harvests, food riots, a credit crunch, and unemployment piling up. By early 1848, the worst of the economic depression was actually easing, but people's expectations had started to rise again, and that's exactly when the political system cracked. The old order in France, the German states, Austria, and Italy suddenly looked weak, and liberal and nationalist movements tried to rewrite the map of Europe at once. For the Rothschilds, this was not a distant drama. By now, they were the bankers of the conservative regimes: Austrian imperial finance, countless German and Italian states, and of course, the French monarchy. When street politics turned against kings and princes, it naturally turned against their bankers too. An anonymous letter to the London House even raged that the people didn't just want their lost money back, they wanted the skin of the infamous Jewish family. The personal and physical danger was real. In Vienna, the Rothschild office was literally next door to the arsenal. When revolutionaries stormed it and lynched the war minister, armed men took up positions on the roof of the Rothschild building. It got so bad that one of their staff went back to rescue the bank's papers. He dressed up as a milkman so he could slip through the streets unnoticed. Ansel, who ran the Vienna house, decided it was safer to stay in the countryside for a month. In Frankfurt, Amschel tried to ride it out. Crowds gathered outside his house, barricades went up, even bullets hit the building, but he stayed put, hung patriotic flags from his windows, and kept the office open as long as he could. Financially, this was probably the scariest moment in the whole book. The most serious threat wasn't someone looting their townhouses, it was the collapse in the value of the government bonds they held. In 1847, James in Paris had taken on a huge chunk of new French 3% rents, expecting to sell most of it on to investors at a profit. Instead, when the Republic was proclaimed, the price of those bonds fell to less than half what he had paid, and he was still contractually obligated to keep paying large installments to the French treasury in cash. At the same time, the Paris house owed millions to various railway companies, and it was sitting on a pile of depreciating securities and bills, while its liabilities were in hard money. Observers openly expected the Paris house to fail. Diplomats visited James and described him staring at his bond portfolio like it had turned into waste paper overnight. Rumors flew that he was secretly shipping gold out of France in manure carts and getting ready to run. What actually keeps the dynasty alive here is the playbook we've seen all through the book, pushed to its limits. First, the houses stand by each other. In the middle of the panic, one of the cousins writes that the only thing that matters is keeping the name honorable, and that one house must support the others with all its strength because the dishonor of one would hit them all. That's not just nice language. Practically, it means liquidity and credit flowing across borders inside the family when outside markets have frozen. There's a quieter lesson that fits the whole House of Rothschild story. Even this dynasty is not invincible. In earlier chapters, their network, speed, and nerve almost made them look untouchable. In 1848, you see how quickly paper wealth can be cut in half, how fast crowds can turn on you, and how much they still depend on trust between the brothers, with governments, and with markets. They survive, but not by magic. They survive because the network is real. The houses really do back each other, and they're willing once again to adapt to a new political world instead of pretending the old one can be brought back. What I really learned from this family. If I had to squeeze first half of the 2-century Rothschild history into a single set of rules, it would sound something like this. The first lesson is simple. Be the right person in the right place at the right time on purpose. Meyer and Frankfurt, Nathan and Manchester, and then London, James and Paris. None of that looked epic in the moment. It was just a family putting people where trade and money were starting to move and staying there. When wars, crises, and booms hit, they were already inside the key markets, not trying to rush in from the outside. The second big thing is information and network. They didn't win just because they had money. They won because they knew what was happening before most people, and they had a network that could act on it quickly. Private couriers, code letters, faster ships, agents everywhere. That meant they heard about battles, treaties, defaults, and panics earlier than governments did. Then, they could move gold and credit across borders while everyone else was still guessing. In business terms, capital is not enough. You need faster, better information and a trusted network that can execute quickly. And the last piece is the house itself. The name, the trust, the secrecy. Rothschild becomes a kind of guarantee. If one brother signs, all the brothers stand behind it. Inside the family, they share information very openly. Outside, they keep it tight and discreet. They argue, they have ego clashes, but when it really matters, they back each other and protect the name. That combination, right place, right time, right information, and a name everyone can rely on, is basically the playbook that kept them at the top for more than 2 centuries.